Hello everyone, my name is John Sierra and I am a Tolkien scholar, and that means that I have been learning about the works of J.R.R. Tolkien for a long time, for several decades as a matter of fact, ever since the 80s when I first read The Hobbit as a child, and here I am in the year 2024 trying to share the knowledge that I have amassed with all of you. I'm the guy that you can come to with any question about The Lord of the Rings, whether it's The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, The Silmarillion, Tolkien's work is what I meant to say at first, any of his books really, or even stuff actually about Tolkien. We have a lot, and I do mean a lot of questions to get to today. We have 27 questions. That is the most I've ever featured in a video. Most of them are on the short side. That's why I was able to feature quite so many. I don't mean that the questions themselves are short, but that there's a lot of them that I can sum up and answer very, very rapidly. But even though we have to kind of go through this quickly, I am not going to deny you guys a reading, and today I'm going to be reading from The Fellowship of the Ring, being the first part of The Lord of the Rings, and I wanted to read a little bit about Tom Bombadil today, or the section containing Tom Bombadil, and the reason is because, you know, when I first read The Lord of the Rings, when I was about, 11 or 12 years old, I did not understand the importance of the character, I didn't understand his function, I didn't understand why he was there, I didn't like the character, I didn't like this section of the book, the 2 chapters that feature him. And over time, I've come to realize that he's incredibly important. He's definitely a big part of the narrative. And if you don't think that Tom Bombadil is important, and you think that the book would be better off without him, all I can tell you is read it again. Just read it again. Because people say, oh, well, I skip over that part. You'll only appreciate it by reading it in the context of the entire book. And I'm not just saying skip to those 2 chapters in the House of Tom Bombadil and Fog on the Barrow Downs. I'm saying read The Fellowship of the Ring and The Two Towers and The Return of the King again, including Bombadil. And I wanted to read about a little bit of a Bombadil section today because recently we had some news come out from the Amazon streaming show The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, which showed a picture of Tom Bombadil speaking to the character called the Stranger, which is probably Gandalf, right? And it's just a picture, so we've seen that Tom Bombadil is going to be in the show. We have seen what he looks like, and it's a very, very book-accurate costume, which is interesting because that has been the weakest aspect of the Rings of Power, is the costuming. But anyway, due to this, I have been and not just me, but all the people in Quora who work in the Tolkien space, have been flooded with a lot of questions about Bombadil. I think I only have one Bombadil question in here today, but there were so many throughout this past week. I did answer many of them. I am only including, I believe, one in the video. There were a lot that I could not answer because they were specific to the TV show, basically asking what is he going to be doing in the show, what is his powers in the show, and I don't know. It's not out. It's not out till August, so I don't have any advanced knowledge of Bombadil in the Rings of Power. As a matter of fact, yeah, I don't have any advanced knowledge about anything about the Rings of Power. I don't work for Amazon. I don't work on the show. If I did, it would be a little different. There would be some things that I would change. But regardless, let's get to the rating. So I really wanted to focus on the part where Frodo was dreaming while he's sleeping in Tom Bombadil's house. And this is very shortly after the dinner where, I believe it's shortly after where Bombadil wore the ring. But, or maybe it's before it. But either way, I wanted to read this section here. Okay. In the dead night, Frodo lay in a dream without light. Then he saw the young moon rising. Under its thin light there loomed before him a black wall of rock, pierced by a dark arch like a great gate. It seemed to Frodo that he was lifted up and passing over. He saw that the rock wall was a circle of hills, and that within it was a plain. And then in the midst of the plain stood a pinnacle of stone, like a vast tower, but not made by hands. On its top stood the figure of a man. The moon, as it rose, seemed to hang for a moment above his head and glistened in his white hair as the wind stirred it. Up from the dark plain below came the crying of fell voices and the howling of many wolves. Suddenly a shadow, like the shape of great wings, passed across the moon. The figure lifted his arms, and a light flashed from the staff that he wielded. A mighty eagle swept down and bore him away. The voices wailed and the wolves yammered. There was a noise like a strong wind blowing, and on it was borne the sound of hoofs, galloping, galloping, galloping from the east. Black riders, thought Frodo as he wakened, with the sound of the hoofs still echoing in his mind. He wondered if he would ever again have the courage to leave the safety of these stone walls. He lay motionless, still listening, but all was now silent, and at last he turned and fell asleep again, or wandered into some other unremembered dream. At his side Pippin lay, dreaming pleasantly, but a change came over his dreams, and he turned and groaned. Suddenly he woke, or thought he had waked, yet still he heard in his darkness the sound that had disturbed his dream, tip-tap squeak. The noise was like branches fretting in the wind, twig fingers scraping wall and window, creak, creak, creak. He wondered if there were willow trees close to the house, and then suddenly he had a dreadful feeling that he was not in an ordinary house at all, but inside the willow, and listening to that horrible, dry, creaking voice laughing at him again. He sat up and felt the soft pillows yield to his hands, and he lay down again relieved. He seemed to hear the echo of words in his ears: fear nothing, have peace until the morning, heed no nightly noises. Then he went to sleep again. It was the sound of water that Merry heard falling in his quiet sleep, water streaming down gently and then spreading irresistibly all round the house into a dark, shoreless pool. It gurgled under walls and was rising slowly but surely. I shall be drowned, he thought. It will find its way in, and then I shall drown. He felt that he was lying in a soft, slimy bog, and springing up he set his foot on the corner of a cold, hard flagstone. Then he remembered where he was, and lay down again. He seemed to hear, or remember hearing, nothing past his doors or windows save moonlight and starlight and the wind off the hilltop. A little breath of sweet air moved the curtain. He breathed deep and fell asleep again. As far as he could remember, Sam slept through the night in deep content, if logs are contented. So it's interesting, you see the four hobbits sleeping in Bombadil's house, and Bombadil sort of warns them, you might have some strange dreams, there are noises, don't heed them, don't worry about it, you're safe. And Merry and Pippin are having these like very anxiety dreams regarding drowning or being stuck in Old Man Willow again. Sam sleeps like a log. But Frodo dreams of something that seems, in the moment, if you're reading this for the first time, very abstract, but he's actually dreaming of Gandalf being at the top of Orthanc. And the description of the ring of stones with the plane in the center and the spire in the center of the plane is Isengard. And the eagle, of course, is Gwaihir. It's interesting that he sees the figure of a man who has white hair and has a staff, but he doesn't make the connection to Gandalf. Or at least, if he did, he didn't write it in his memoir. Because at this point in the story, you don't know that Gandalf had been captured by Sauron. And that's why he hadn't joined Frodo. As a matter of fact, we're still in Book 1, which is everything up to and including the Ford of Bruinen, where Frodo faces off against the ring wraiths, and then the flood comes, and then Frodo passes out. And then Book 2 begins where he's in Rivendell, and then Gandalf is right there, and Bilbo's there, and they tell him everything that happened. But anyway, we have a lot of questions. We have 27 questions to get to, so let's start with the first one. How are Glorfindel and Aragorn related? So we don't really know much about Glorfindel in terms of his family, so we can't say how exactly he's related to Aragorn, but they would be extremely distantly related. Glorfindel's family tree was never revealed, only that he was a kinsman of Turgon, who was the king of Gondolin. Aragorn had some elvish ancestry, and part of that is from Turgon. We know, of course, how one can easily trace Aragorn's ancestry back to Isildur, and then back to Elendil, and then back through the kings of Númenor to Elros, Elrond's brother. Before that was his father, Earendil and then his father Tur. Tur had a wife whose name was Idril, and that was Turgon's daughter. So Turgon is a distant grandfather of Aragorn, just as the likes of Isildur and Elros are and such. With Glorfindel as an unspecified kinsman of the king, they were related in some way, but not closely enough for Glorfindel to be considered royalty. So it's likely that they were probably cousins of some sort, which would make Glorfindel an extremely distant cousin to Aragorn. Okay, next question. So this next question came in by request from Zishan Ali, who asks, when did Gandalf suspect that the Necromancer was Sauron? When did he know for sure? So he suspected it pretty much the whole time, but it took him a long time to confirm it. When the Necromancer appeared at Aemon Lanc, and the area started to become known as Dol Guldur, Gandalf harbored a suspicion that the Necromancer was in fact Sauron. This wasn't shared by his colleagues, such as Saruman, who believed that the Necromancer was either probably the Witch King or maybe one of the other Nazgûl. No one knew where the Witch King had went after he fled Angmar, no one in Middle-earth at least, so it could possibly have been him, but we do know, actually, through narrative voice, that he went to Mordor. Gandalf went to Dol Guldur to investigate, but Sauron hid himself, and Gandalf did not learn anything. Still harboring suspicions, and he was bolstered by the evil power continuing to spread throughout Greenwood the Great, which became Mirkwood, he went again, and this time he went in secret. He snuck in, and he met Thrain II there, and Thrain gave him the map and the key to Erebor, and confirmed that he, meaning the Necromancer, had taken his Ring of Power. While an ordinary Necromancer might have an interest in the Ring of Power, only Sauron would take the ring like that and then have no interest in the map and the key. Gandalf had confirmed what he had suspected all along. Next question. Okay, so this one's not a Bombadil question, it's sort of Bombadil adjacent, which was, are the trees of the Old Forest and Old Man Willow Huorns? Maybe they are. I think Old Man Willow might be something else entirely. Treebeard seems to think that the Old Forest was a place that the Entwives and the Entmaidens, who had disappeared long ago, may have liked that kind of place, perhaps even thinking that they may have wound up there and became tree-ish. And he asked Merry and Pippin to let him know if they ever confirmed that there were Entwives or Entmaidens in the Old Forest. They, of course, did not, and we don't know if the moving trees mentioned early on in The Lord of the Rings were Huorns, which are trees that have become Entish and they can move around, or Ents that have become tree-ish, or something else entirely. It's my personal belief that there are no Ents in the Old Forest, but there are Huorns. And their lack of shepherds is why they are so wild and unpredictable. Old Man Willow, however, he may or may not be a Huorn, but I tend to believe he's something else. In The Return of the Shadow, which contains a lot of earlier drafts of The Lord of the Rings, Bombadil explains that Old Man Willow is a heathen spirit that is trapped in a tree. This may or may not be the case in the published version. The explanation was left out. That doesn't make it not true. But it was a rather old draft. Frodo was called Bingo, Merry was called Marmaduke, Pippin was called Odo. It was a very early version of the story, but it does point to the idea that Tolkien thought of Old Man Willow as being unique, so it's possible that he may have continued to believe that he was unique. Next question. So here is an honest-to-goodness Tom Bombadil question. Could Tom Bombadil willingly destroy the ring at Mount Doom? So Tolkien stated that no one could destroy the One Ring willingly, but he did have an exception, which was Gollum. And this was in a hypothetical where Gollum destroyed the ring and himself out of spite towards Sauron. And I don't think that he was thinking at all about Bombadil in this case, who is too fundamentally different from all of the characters to be considered a person. Bombadil has no attachment to the ring, nor does it have any power over him. The One Ring being handed over to him was discussed briefly at the Council of Elrond, but they rejected the idea because he wouldn't understand the importance of the ring, or at least that's what they thought, and he may cast it away, or he may give it to someone as a trinket. Besides not really being able to trust him to keep it safe, the point of the excursion was not to keep the ring safe, it was to destroy the ring. Keeping it safe benefits Sauron, destroying it does not. So could Bombadil, in this hypothetical, have tossed the ring into Mount Doom? Yes, of course. He could have flipped it in the air, did a backflip, and kicked it, and hit it right into the fire. And then he would sing a merry tune about it. However, the hypothetical is completely unreasonable to consider because Bombadil would never go there. He wouldn't be in Mordor. Bombadil is not unable to travel outside of his domain, as some people say, nor is he powerless outside of his domain, as some people say, but he is completely unwilling to step out of his domain. He is the master there, and no one is above him, and he has set this boundary for himself a long time ago, and he refuses to go beyond it. Bombadil would just not travel to Mordor for any reason. Okay, next question. Did Aragorn's lineage come from both Elendil and Isildur, or only Elendil? Did Isildur have any sons? So Aragorn's lineage comes from both Elendil and actually both of his sons, Isildur and Anarion. Isildur himself had 4 sons. They were named Elendil, Aratan, Cirion, and Valandil. The first 3 were killed in the same mess where Isildur died. But Valandil lived, and he became the king of Arnor. Aragorn is a direct descendant of Valandil, and therefore he's a direct descendant of Isildur. He's also descended from Isildur's brother Anarion, who is considered to be a king of Gondor, and because there was a distant descendant of Anarion, who was a woman named Thiriel, and she married a distant heir of Isildur named Arvedui, and this line led directly to Aragorn. Arvedui tried to claim the Thiriel should have been the queen of Gondor, the ruling queen, not the queen consort, but Gondor did not do that. They didn't have ruling queens, and they didn't recognize Aragorn as being a descendant of Anarion because it was not through the male line. Of course, that was the opinion, at least, of Denethor II. Faramir, his son, felt differently about it. Okay, next question. How did Shelob survive in Mordor for an extended period of time? Well, you know, she had plenty of food. Shelob settled in her spot in the mountains long before Sauron even came to Mordor. She was fleeing from Beleriand. She would capture anyone that came near her lair, usually goblins, and she would devour them, and there was no shortage of goblins. Sauron was aware of Shelob. He knew about her. He thought of her as like a pet cat that you keep outside, and he had no command over her, like you might not have any command over a pet cat, but he did find it useful that she was there. And so he made a point to feed her by driving prisoners that he no longer had any use for into her lair. So the goblins, at this point, they all kind of work for Sauron. They're aware of her. They know where her lair is. They're avoiding her, but Sauron made sure that she was kept, we'll say, fat and happy, and that she would not say, there's no food here anymore, and I'm going to look for a different place. He wanted her to be there because it made one of the ways to get into Mordor extremely dangerous. Okay, next question. So this question came in by request of Jonah Falcon, and shout out to Jonah Falcon. I remember you from that old Talking Yankees show on public access television back in the day in New York City. But anyway, Jonah asks, were the trolls in The Hobbit aware of the value and the location of their treasure and weapons like dragons are, or did they simply not care and they only knew they were plunder that was worth something? So I don't think they could have been aware. Smaug was stated to know the value and function of and even the location of each and every bit of treasure, down to the tiniest coin, everything that he had. So much so that the moment Bilbo removed a single little insignificant cup, he was aware of it and he became very angry about it. This is explained as being something that all dragons can do. By comparison, the trolls' treasure is a mix of rotted food and whatever plunder they found. Some of it was junk and some of it was treasure. The closest thing to any sort of security seems to have been a magic talking purse, which may or may not have been an embellishment in the story by the hand of Bilbo, who may simply have gotten caught because he wasn't a very experienced pickpocket at the time. The trolls are crude and unintelligent, but they're also said to be smarter than the average cave troll. They don't seem particularly attentive about anything regarding their surroundings, not even the time of day, which gets them killed. Elrond theorized that the plunder was plundered from other plunderers. We knew that the swords came out of Gondolin, and therefore they were plundered by Morgoth's forces, sort of a spoils of war sort of situation. They probably changed evil hands over many years. This would also explain why the goblins were able to recognize them on sight. They had been seen in the years between the fall of Gondolin and the Hobbit. They were not just these terrible weapons out of ancient lore, but they existed in living memory for the goblins. So the trolls probably knew they were valuable. They may even knew that they were elvish, but I would certainly say that they don't know the significance or their true value. Okay, next question. Here's a question I'm rather fond of. How do elves measure time in Tolkien's mythology? Do they have a concept of days or years, or is it based on their ages? So it's a good question, and it's something that it definitely does have an answer. The concept of time in the very early period of the Legendarium is very, very interesting. Iluvatar, who is God, and the Ainur, who were the angels, lived in what is called the Timeless Halls. So they had no real concept of time, but with their music, they created something that is based off of the concept of time, because music has a beginning, it has a middle, and it has an ending. Though the end of the universe was veiled from their vision, the world and everything in it has a lifespan. That being said, the Ainur created something that was as timeless as they could. During the spring of Arda, there were no seasons, there was no day, there was no night, there was no growth, there was no death, just this constant Eden-esque state. The breaking of the lamps gave Middle-earth its first night, which lasted until the first rising of the sun. Though the elves of Middle-earth would come to use solar years, they would tell time just the way that anybody else does, using the sun, using the moon to mark the passage of time. They originally didn't have these things. They just had constant night. They only had stars to guide them. The count of time in Arda did not begin until the creation of the two trees, which were said to, they were used to tell time by when they waxed and waned, but the light of the trees did not reach Middle-earth. So how did the elves tell time before the sun and the moon and the trees? The answer is that the Valar had a system known as Valian years, and this was the system that the trees were based on. One Valian year is about 9.5 solar years. In the years before the sun, elves that were in Middle-earth, who were not in contact with the Valar, likely did not tell time at all. They were undying, they were unchanging, and they were the only beings with voices. They had not met the other races, especially the mortal races yet, and the awakening of men came with the first sunrise. So there you go. Okay, next question. Will someone in Tolkien's family ever complete his abandoned The Lord of the Rings sequel titled The New Shadow? No. There was not enough of it to finish, and there's a good reason to not finish it. Tolkien's story was a rough draft of only one chapter, which is about 13 pages long, about two men having this conversation about the nature of evil and hinting that there was a cult growing in Gondor. Tolkien felt that the story was not worth pursuing, it was not worth writing, it was certainly not going to be worth reading. The New Shadow is an interesting relic of his writing, but with so little to go on, no one could just finish it. They would have to create it. They would have to write an entire story based around this very, very small snippet. No one in Tolkien's family has ever expressed interest in finishing his work. Even his late son Christopher only felt comfortable editing his work. And he notably shied away from filling in blanks unless he absolutely had to. Okay, next question. Did Galadriel's power increase after leaving Middle-earth and returning to Valinor? If so, by how much? No, they did not. There was no special property of the Undying Lands that would make Galadriel more powerful than she already was. In the past, elves could go to Valinor and they could see the light of the two trees, and that would make them more powerful than they were. But those trees are not there anymore when Galadriel sailed to the west, and she had already seen them long time ago. She came from the Undying Lands, so she was already as powerful as she was ever going to get. Okay, next question. Here's a question that came in by the request of Zach Kabia, who asks, what do you think the Nazgûl do in their free time? That's an interesting question. I think it really depends on your thoughts about what free time means, but I would say that they don't have free time in the sense that they're not free to do as they will. They are thralls. They're slaves to the Dark Lord. They're bound to the Nine are bound to the One is bound to Sauron. They had no will of their own, so they were not free in any sense of the word. That's probably not what you meant, right? It's still relevant, though. What you likely might be wondering here is if Sauron has no orders for them, or if he's not there to give orders, what do they do? The fact is they can only do his will. Anything that they do is the will of Sauron, up to and including the Witch King creating a realm called Angmar and waging war against Arnor. Even if they are idle, it's because Sauron wishes them to be idle. One example seen in The Lord of the Rings is how they would not cross the Anduin, even though they had the perfect opportunity to attack the Fellowship while they were vulnerable, simply because Sauron did not wish them to cross the river. They really had no control over themselves at all. Okay, next question. Okay, here's a question that came in from Ben Dean Hui. I hope I'm saying that right. Could Morgoth and his servants have any chance of conquering Tol Eressëa? No, not a chance. Absolutely not. Morgoth and his army lost the war in Middle-earth, and that was his territory. That was Morgoth's home turf, so to speak. There was no way that he could conquer any part of the Undying Lands, even the tiny little island of Eressëa, and he knew it. That's why Morgoth absconded to Middle-earth with the Silmarils. He fled from Tulkas and Aroma. And when the host of the Valar, which did not actually include any Valar, just a lot of elves and Maiar, when they came, he did not participate in the actual war. Morgoth was cowardly, and he knew that he was outclassed. He went against the Valar when he was at the absolute zenith of his power, and he still lost, so he would not be able to conquer Tol Eressëa. Okay, next question. Here's one that came in from Jonah Coleman, who asks, how did the dwarves have time to build Balin's tomb? Had he died well before Ori's final account in the Book of Mazarbul? Ori did not write that final account, which was at least several days after Balin's death. So I'm going to show an image on screen. And this is a facsimile of the Book of Mazarbul written by Ori. This section, at least, is written by Ori. Ori wrote in Westron language, and the script that he used was Elvish. It was Tengwar. And to read it, years now, ready, sorrow. Yesterday being the 10th of November, Balin, Lord of Moria, fell in Dimril Dale. He went alone to look in Mirrormere. An orc shot him from behind a stone. We slew the orc, but many more came. Up from the east. Up the Silverlode. We rescued Balin's body. A sharp battle. We have barred the gates, but doubt can hold them long if no escape. It will be a horrible fate to suffer, but I shall hold. This describes the account of Balin dying. There's a lot of fragmentary stuff because there's pieces missing from it. But it was not the end of the book. There were many pages after this suggesting many days had passed with the records being kept, but Gandalf was only able to make out several small passages, and then we get to the last page, which looks like this. There, put that up there. And you'll notice that it's not the same style of writing. The runes are Erebor-style runes. They are dwarvish, and it describes the deaths of several dwarves, Frar and Lali and Oin. If you look at the bottom of it, though, there's a different person that wrote "They Are Coming" in Tengwar, which may have been Ori, because he wrote the earlier Tengwar, but really it could have been any of the final survivors before they perished. So the book had multiple hands writing in it, and had several accounts of days past that were not legible. They did specifically recover Balin's body, so it makes sense that they gave their lord a proper burial. Note that they were not constantly under siege, but rather trying to expand and take Moria back from the orcs. Balin didn't even die inside of Moria, but he was outside of it. He went to the Mirror, and he was brought back in for burial. So they were not like constantly under attack. They were the aggressors, and they were being picked off slowly until the end, when finally the goblins all amassed and attacked at once, and they were overwhelmed. Okay, next question. Here's a question that came in from Keanu Dobris, who asks, why was Frodo so tired carrying the ring during the journey to Mordor, but not Bilbo, seeming to be perfect when he carried the ring during his journey in The Hobbit? They seemed to carry it by the same amount of time, but Frodo was clearly more exhausted. There's two reasons here, but they're really kind of the same reason. They're very tied into each other. The first reason is that it was not about the time that you spend carrying the One Ring. Gollum carried it for 5 centuries. It was more about where it was carried, keeping in mind that the One Ring is pretty much a piece of Sauron, and it has its own will. In The Hobbit, it was very happy to be with Bilbo. The One Ring had been under a river for thousands of years, so it was happy to be with Gollum, and then Gollum really wasn't helping it return to Sauron's hand. He just stayed under a mountain for over 5 centuries, so it was happy to jump ship again and leave the Misty Mountains. The One Ring had no reason to burden Bilbo. The second reason, which is really just an extension of the first, it's the same reason really, is that the One Ring is aware that Frodo is trying to destroy it. It obviously does not want to be destroyed, and so it tries to escape him. First, it pollutes the mine of Boromir, it entices Gollum to break his promise and bring the hobbits to Shelob, and finally it just decides that Frodo can't destroy it if Frodo can't actually get to Mordor, and actually get to Mount Doom. So it burdened him greatly. It wanted him to collapse and die in Mordor, where he would be found, and then Sauron gets the ring down. It was weighing him down, and it was a spiritual weight, not a physical weight. Sam felt the weight of the ring when he wore it, or when he carried it as well, but not when he carried Frodo, who had the ring. Frodo has weight, but Sam mused that it was sort of a different type of weight. Okay, next question. Are Elrond, Galadriel, and Celeborn related in any way? Well, if you're asking if they're related by marriage, yes. If you're asking if they're related by blood, yes, but more distantly. The big obvious thing is obviously that Galadriel and Celeborn are a married couple. Their daughter, who's named Celebrian, is married to Elrond, and that makes him their son-in-law. They are, however, distantly related, as all the elves are. Celeborn is also Elrond's great-grand uncle. Celeborn's brother, Galadriel, was the father of Nimloth, who was the mother of Elwing, which was Elrond's mother. Any familial blood relation that Galadriel and Elrond would have, or that Galadriel and Celeborn would have, would be very, very far back. And they would, of course, the further back you go, they're eventually going to have a common ancestor. The vast majority of the elves were all descended from 3 brothers, after all. Okay, next question. Okay, Okay, here's another one from Ben Dean, who asks, why didn't Sauron's deadliest servants unleash against Ar-Pharazôn and the Númenóreans when they came to Mordor to capture Sauron? I thought the Wraith's black aura would drive any mortal beings mad and afraid. Because it was advantageous at the time for Sauron to be captured and to be brought to Númenor. Sauron wanted Númenor gone, and he could not really do that from Mordor. They could come to him for battle. They were not going to send everybody, just the soldiers. Sauron wasn't interested in wiping out the soldiers. He was interested in wiping out everything, the culture, the entirety of Númenor, not just the people, everything they stood for. Let's look at a passage from the Silmarillion. In an hour unlooked for by men, this doom befell, on the 39th day since the passing of the fleets. Then suddenly fire burst from Menelharma, and there came a mighty wind and a tumult of the earth, and the sky reeled and the hills slid, and Númenor went down into the sea, with all of its children and its wives, and its maidens and its ladies proud, and all its gardens, and its halls, and its towers, its tombs, and its riches, and its jewels, and its webs, and its things painted and carven, and its laughter, and its mirth, and its music, its wisdom, and its lore, they vanished forever. That was the goal. The entire culture being wiped out. He cannot do that from Mordor, and he cannot invade and raise Númenor. This would require traveling across the sea, and there would be a naval battle, and that's not one he would win, not against Númenor. They were a naval nation. And all of those things that fell into the abyss, one of them was Sauron, and he was laughing. I'm going to give you another passage here. And Sauron, sitting in his black seat in the midst of the temple, had laughed when he heard the trumpets of Ar-Pharazôn sounding for battle. And again he had laughed when he heard the thunder of the storm, and a third time, even as he laughed at his own thought, thinking, what would he do now in the world, being rid of the Edain forever? He was taken in the midst of his mirth, and his seat and his temple fell into the abyss. So Sauron is, in the moment of his total victory, he's achieving his goal, even wondering what he's going to do next, now that his ambition was fulfilled, and he laughed as he fell into the abyss. He was harmed by the Akalabeth. He could no longer take fair form, but he did not escape or even plot to escape. He sat there on the throne of the temple, laughing as the island collapsed with him on it. He couldn't do that from Mordor. They would send more, and they would send more, and then eventually they would give up or not send any more. But neither of these destroys their culture. Okay, next question. Here's a question that came in from Kumali Kokavale. Hope I'm saying it right. Was Fëanor a great warrior? Did he possess great physical strength and bravery? Yes, and yes. Fëanor did not kill a Balrog in the First Age like Glorfindel did, or like Ithilien did, but he did fight the Balrogs, as in all of them. Killing a Balrog is a mighty feat, and the person that does always pays with their life. But Fëanor wasn't just killed by the Balrogs, he actively fought them, and not for a short while. I'm going to read you a brief passage from the Silmarillion. Fëanor was surrounded, with few friends about him. Long he fought on, and undismayed, though he was wrapped in fire and wounded with many wounds. But at the last he was smitten to the ground by Gothmog, lord of Balrogs, whom Ithilien after slew in Gondolin. There he would have perished, had not his sons in that moment come up with the force to his aid, and the Balrogs left him and departed to Angband. So the phrases they use here, long he fought on, and at last, tells us it was not a quick battle. Fëanor did not just get killed by the Balrogs, he fought them undismayed, even as he was wounded. It was only when Gothmog finally got a shot in that he was done for. And the Balrogs don't even pursue his sons. They knew Fëanor was not going to survive, and they had done their jobs. But they had to think for a moment that if one elf alone can fend them off for so long, his 7 sons, they might be best to leave them alone. Okay, next question. In which book or movie does Glorfindel appear in The Lord of the Rings? He's not in the movies. Glorfindel does not appear in any of the films. The role that he was to take in the Fellowship of the Ring was given to Arwen. He also appeared in The Return of the King as a guest at Arwen's wedding. This has led a lot of people to state that one of the blonde elves seen in the film version is Glorfindel. It's not, though. He's not mentioned to be Glorfindel, and the name Glorfindel does not appear in the credits. I don't believe the character was ever intended to be Glorfindel. He would have been credited as Glorfindel, even if it was a non-speaking role, like Círdan's. I'm not aware of it, but it's possible that someone that was involved in the making of the Peter Jackson films may have confirmed this in a way like, sure, why not, and anything to get these fans off my back. But that doesn't mean that the intention was there, that this nameless elf represents Glorfindel. Okay, next question. Here's a question that came from Victorinox Rush. Hope I'm saying the first name right. In The Lord of the Rings, do the elves' domestic animals such as horses and dogs have extended lifespans as the mayoress? This depends on the origin of the animal. The Valar could not gift immortality to man. They could not alter the fate of the elves, but they could gift immortality to animals and to plants. Due to this, all of the plant life and all of the animal life in the Undying Lands is functionally immortal. They have a lifespan like everything does, but the lifespan is equal to that of the world itself. This was for the delight of the Valar. They didn't wish death to stain the land that they lived on, partly out of sadness for departed friends, but also partly out of envy, because they could never depart. So animals derived of Aemon are essentially immortal, though the ones that were brought to Middle-earth would have mated with the beasts of the land long ago and created other races that were not immortal, but they did have extended lifespans, and that was the nature of the Mirrors, for example. They were not immortal, but they were longevous. They had long lifespans. Next question. Here's one that came in from Blue Moon 33, and I like this one because it reminds me of something from my past. What is your theory on what became of Shelob after the events of The Lord of the Rings? Do you think that she met a demise similar to her mother Ungoliant, or could she possibly still be hiding in Middle-earth during the Fourth Age and beyond? So this is one of those things that was left ambiguous in the book. So theories are really all we have. Now, I remember when I was young and I was reading The Two Towers as a young boy, I thought that Shelob had certainly bitten the dust. She was slain by Sam when she bore her full weight down on Sting, which pierced her hide. It was said that not even the strength of the arm of Huorn could pierce her hide with a sword. But her own strength was the greater, and it was her own undoing. Upon seeing the film version, she seems to slink away, wounded, and crawled into a crevice. And at the time, I was a young man, and I wondered why they changed it, because I remembered Shelob dying. But upon revisiting the text again, I realized that Tolkien never stated she died, and that she did slink off, but I had assumed she was slinking off to die. Human memory is a funky thing. That being said, Shelob's chances at survival are based on one thing. Could she still hunt? If she could potentially heal from the wounds that Sam gave, if she survived them, would she regain her sight as well? She was blinded, and when I wrote this on Quora, somebody said, well, she had a lot of eyes and Sam only pierced one of them, but no, that's not what blinded her. She was blinded by the light of the Elendil in the File of Galadriel, and it just said that she was blinded and not whether that was a temporary thing or a permanent thing. We know that, like, for example, that same light in the Silmarils, that was hollowed, so it's a bit different, but it burned Morgoth's hand. So there are permanent injuries like that, like Aryan burned Morgoth as well. But anyway, I don't want to muse too much here because we have a lot of questions today, but so if she could somehow regain her sight, is that going to be before or after she starves to death? And would she, as the question suggests, try to devour herself in desperation like her mother Ungoliant did? I think if she survived, she may have tried to feed on corpses, which she did not prefer. The goblins stated she prefers her prey live. But there would be no shortage of corpses, but they were a bit far away. The battle at Morannon and everything, that was far to the north of her lair, and I don't think she would be safe traveling in the open, especially while wounded and possibly blinded. Sauron was not around to feed her anymore, so she was kind of on her own. Personally, I think she died. She died either of her wounds, just by bleeding out, or she died of starvation afterwards. Okay, next question. This question comes in from the Oski Boski, who asks, are there any Ainur who did not sing in the Ainulindalë? No, they all sang, and thus they all had a hand in creation. The fact that all of the Ainur sung in the event is the entire point of it. Previous to this, the Ainur had come to Ilúvatar and they made music for him, but it was always music of their own design and always in singles or in small groups. The Ainulindalë was a remarkable event because it contained all of the Ainur, even the ones that would not descend into the world that they helped create. And due to the fact that while they sang the music, Ilúvatar led them in the themes. Think of it like God is singing the tune, he hums it out, and then they all sort of take over from that theme. They expand on it, they harmonize with it, they improvise, and they build upon it. Melkor was singing themes that were discordant, and they were of his own design. And so did, some of the Ainur that surrounded him got swept up in that. But every note, whether it was harmonious or whether it was discordant, represented a thought, and they would see the inner thoughts of their mind made flesh in the world. Melkor especially would see all of his thoughts made flesh in the world. Okay, next question. Okay, so this one comes in from Book Reader, who asks, why didn't Sauron know about the Shire and hobbits? Surely after hundreds of years and being a demigod, he would have known something. Well, let's dispense with the whole demigod thing as a descriptor for Sauron, or as a descriptor for anybody, really, in The Lord of the Rings. Sauron is not a demigod, and there aren't demigods of any sort in Tolkien's work, though he acknowledged that people would look at the Valar as a pantheon of gods. His intention was that they were angelic in nature, the greater angels, while the Maiar are the lesser angels, and Sauron is a Maya spirit. He's one of the lesser angels, but he's mighty among their ranks. Now, as for how he didn't know about hobbits, it's very simple. He possessed neither omnipotence nor omnipresence, and up until the closing years of the Third Age, such a small people with small lives and small ambitions and no great power to challenge him or to offer to him, they were just basically beneath his notice. It should also be mentioned that hobbits are not even that well known in many parts of Middle-earth. They once lived all over, but they were nomadic and they were secretive. They were shy of the big people. They lived openly in Eriador, most specifically in Arthedain, but outside of the borders of the ancient kingdom of Arnor, they are unknown or even considered mythical. Think of the reaction that Denethor had to the dream that his sons had regarding three things: a halfling, Isildur's Bane, and Imladris. He didn't know what a halfling was. He didn't know what Isildur's Bane was. The only thing he knew about was Imladris. And then consider how Pippin was viewed in Minas Tirith as almost like a character that stepped out of a storybook. The fascination was also present in Rohan. I think it was a little more respectful there. These men were previously men of the North themselves, so they had heard tales of the halflings, but they had never actually laid eyes on one. Theoden is practically in awe of Merry. So hobbits aren't that well known even among those who would be in friendship with them, and totally beneath the notice of Sauron. Okay, next question. What was the reason for Tolkien using two different languages for elves in Middle-earth? I'm assuming that the question refers to Quenya and Sindarin, and I get this a lot. The elves actually don't even just have two languages, they have a bunch of languages, but Quenya and Sindarin are sort of the main ones. Tolkien, of course, did this because he wanted to. He just liked to create languages, and he had been doing so for quite a long time before he even wrote anything about Middle-earth. So in universe, though, it makes perfect sense. The elves were still developing their primitive language, which was called Quendian, when they were sundered into two groups, the Amanyar and the Umanyar. The ones that went to the west and lived in Aman, Aemanyar, and the ones that stayed in Middle-earth, the Umanyar. They continued to develop their language, but because their cultures differentiated, the groups developed the language differently. This is why they share so many similarities, because they are languages that have a single root. Okay, next question. Another language question: what languages are used in The Lord of the Rings besides Elvish? So the main language, which is the one that in the text is represented as English, is called Westron. The elves, of course, had their languages, actually several languages. Quenya, Sindarin are the main ones, as I said, but there are other dialects. Most of the common speech, which is Westron, is represented as English, and it seems to be a derivative of the language that later became Rohanese, which is represented in the text as Old English. The dwarves had their own secret language, which was called Kuzdul. The Ents had Entish and Old Entish, and there were a great many indigenous tribes that had their own tongues. But Westron was so common, hence being called the common speech, that everyone spoke Westron. Okay, next question. What is the origin of the nickname Estel for young Aragorn given by Elrond? Is there a specific meaning behind it, or was it a spontaneous choice? First of all, I just want to say, a lot of people who answered this question that weren't me answered it not incorrectly, because they did say what Estel means, which is hope. By the way, it means hope. But a lot of people tried to correct the person and say, no, that didn't come from Aragorn. From Aragorn. It didn't come from Elrond. It came from Aragorn's mother, and that's not actually true. Elrond did give Aragorn the name Estel when the boy came to live with him at the age of 2. Aragorn's father had been killed, and his ancestry and his heritage were hidden from him until he turned 20. Estel, as I said, means hope, and it means that in both primary Elvish languages, both in Quenya and in Sindarin. In the Parma Eldalamaryn 17, Tolkien said that hope is a very simplistic meaning of Estel, that the longer version would be hope, trust, a temper of mind, steady, fixed in purpose, and difficult to dissuade and unlikely to fall into despair or abandon its purpose. So squishing that all into Estel is rather easier. Elves were big on giving meaningful names, and they were also good at gauging a person's entire persona just at a glance, even if the person was a small child. Okay, next question. Did Gandalf know about the Balrog prior to going into the mines of Moria, or was he genuinely surprised by it? He didn't know about the Balrog, but I wouldn't necessarily use the word surprise. I would say he was dismayed. To me, to register surprise, it would suggest not merely experiencing the unexpected, but experiencing something that you thought was just not going to happen. Gandalf did not know that there was a Balrog in Moria, but he knew something was down there. And not only had he traveled through Moria previously, but he has been in Middle-earth for quite a long while, and the Balrog's awakening was nearly 1,000 years after he had arrived. This tells us that Gandalf was around when the dwarves were killed or driven out of Moria. Only one dwarf saw the Balrog and survived, and he didn't know that it was a Balrog. He didn't know what to call it. He just called it Durin's Bane. So with Gandalf not being aware of the Balrog, that doesn't mean that he was surprised by it. Something was down there. Even after sensing the evil presence and being the brunt of a counterspell so powerful that it nearly killed him, Gandalf didn't know that the presence was a Balrog. When Legolas saw the Balrog and he cried out in dismay that a Balrog had come, and Gimli started screaming as well, Gandalf, no explanation, no shock, dismay. He says, "Now I understand," as if the final piece of the puzzle has been put into place. It's sort of like, I should have known. He is surely dismayed by the situation, but I wouldn't say he is surprised by it. And now we move on to our last question. So, as I said in the first meeting of the Council of Tolkien, sometimes you get a question so ridiculous that I feel the urge to be very silly in answering it. And this is one of those. Why could Frodo not simply have eaten the ring This is the sort of thing that's so ridiculous that it shouldn't even be answered, but I decided to have some fun with it and actually answer it as if it were a serious question. So the reason that Frodo would not eat the ring is because he doesn't want to force poor Samwise to fish it out of his droppings later on. Gandalf mentioned that out of the 7 rings that had been given to the dwarves, only 3 remained. 4 of them were consumed by the dragons. This could be interpreted as consumed by dragons' fire, or it could be literally that the dragons ate the rings. They're both possible. Personally, I think the dragons ate the rings. Dragons definitely ate people, and I don't think that they spit out the jewelry afterwards. Now, Gandalf mentioned that even the flames of the greatest dragon on Caladan the Black would not destroy the One Ring. Now, fire and digestion, they're not the same thing. But based on digestion being a slow process compared to being, incinerated by a dragon's morning breath, the fire is more immediately destructive. If Caladan's flame could not destroy the One Ring, the stomach juices were not going to do it. So, as dragons eat people, and I imagine they eat a lot of metal objects that humans were carrying or wearing, and the fact that these juices actually destroyed the rings of power, the rings were not passed through the dragons unharmed. If the fire can't destroy the ring, and the less destructive stomach juices were not going to do the trick either, I would also gather, as they do eat metal, it would be far more destructive in a dragon's stomach than it would be in a hobbit's stomach. So even if the hobbits eat a lot of meals, I don't think their stomachs are equipped to digest metal. So Frodo would not eat the ring because eating the ring would not destroy it, and it would eventually have to exit his body through the cat flap. And then somebody's going to have to clean it off and then walk it to Mount Doom. So unless you think the ring would somehow go in and not come out, in which case Sauron wins, because the ring, it has to be destroyed, not just kept in somebody's stomach. Otherwise, Sauron wins by sheer military might, or he loses. And then he returns later, after Frodo's long gone, and the One Ring can be found again. So, yeah. Anyway, guys, if you got to this point in the video, 27 questions in all, and you haven't subscribed by now, please subscribe. If you're watching this video, we are trying right now to reach 1,000 subscribers, and I'm recording this on the 4th. It's going to go up on the 5th, or very late on the 5th for members. Consider membership if you want to see all of the videos early, and then of course you guys, everybody else will see this on the 12th. And as of right now, the reason I'm telling you when I'm recording it, we are at 916 subscribers, very close to our goal of 1,000 subscribers, where I can actually have ad revenue, and that would really help me out, because we've been doing this for a bit over a year now, 61 episodes now. So, there has to be some sort of return for all the effort I put into it, but even though I enjoy it so much. Anyway, I'll see you guys next time.